much.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay,
can.
we'll go ahead and get started.
Yes.
So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second My Power Grid Competitive Procurement Work Group session. Great session today. We have a developer panel and some utility presentations to talk about experiences and to talk about some topics that were covered or that were initially addressed in our straw proposal that was released at the beginning of this month. I am Jesse Harlow, the manager of the Resource Adequacy and Retail Choice section here at the Commission, and I'm also leading the charge on this competitive procurement working group. So, as always, work group instructions. This meeting is being recorded. Please be sure to mute your lines. You are being muted as you come into the meeting, but we also want to ensure that you guys continue to check that mute and make sure that we're muted so that we don't have any background noise that's disruptive to others as they're presenting. So there's going to be opportunities for questions and comments throughout this work group session. Please, at first, try to type your questions into the chat function or raise your hand using the raise your hand function. Once we go through those questions and comments, we will open it up to the phone lines. And all the presentations that are being shared today are already uploaded to the competitive procurement webpage. So if anything's missed, you can be ensured that you'll be able to catch back up on it. And like I said, it's being recorded, so we'll post that to the competitive procurement webpage as well. So as I said, it's a great agenda today. We have, starting off with a developer panel, we'll have Laura Sherman from Michigan EIBC moderating that panel, and we have quite the star-studded cast from the developers that will be talking about their experiences and kind of where we see or where we'd like to see the future of competitive procurement here in Michigan go. Then we'll have some presentations from Indiana Michigan Power Company, so they'll give a multi-jurisdictional experience, the experience from a multi-jurisdictional utility, and then we'll follow that up with Consumers Energy and DTE to talk about their experiences as well. So prior to this meeting and setting it up and asking the folks that you saw in the agenda to present, I posed a few questions for the future. So these are questions based out of the straw proposal, as I mentioned. So I asked that all the presenters today discuss how they see all source bidding being carried out throughout this process going forward, the review process and any third-party review concerns, and then the required information to be presented in RFP in advance of submitting proposals, what they feel is necessary in order from a developer standpoint, to submit a good, solid proposal that's the most economic and cost effective, and from a utility perspective, something that will get them the information that is necessary. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Laura Sherman so that she can moderate the panel for the developers. So Laura.
Great, thanks, Jesse. If the panelists can turn their videos on so we can see you, if that's possible. If not, we'll just do your voice. Okay, awesome, great. Thanks, guys. Well, so I'm really excited to have all these wonderful developers joining me today, all of our members. And I'm gonna just ask them first to introduce themselves, and then we've sort of worked together to come up with a list of questions that cover the 3 topic areas that Jesse highlighted here. And I'm going to, hopefully we'll spend about 20 minutes in each area. So first, all source bidding, the second being review of RFPs, and then the third being sort of required information to be presented in an RFP. So if the audience, if folks have questions, if you can put them in the chat while we're in that section, that will make it easier for me to feed in your questions with my questions. And no worries if you miss the section, we'll go back to it later. But that would be the goal, is to sort of divide our time this morning into those 3 sections of about 20 minutes each. So I'm just gonna, in no particular order, run through and ask folks just to introduce themselves and their company and sort of what they generally, what their company does in Michigan. So I'll just go around my screen, starting with Dave Shiflett. And Dave, you are muted. I'm sorry. There you go.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laura, and thank the Public Service Commission, Jesse and Julie and others, Mr. Proudfoot, on having us and arranging this today. I'm Dave Shiflett. I'm with National Grid Renewables, formerly known as Geronimo Energy. We had a rebranding a week ago, and so just want to make that identification. We've had a presence here in Michigan since 2010, wind developer originally, and then have transitioned, like many companies, into solar and storage as well. And I've been the boots on the ground here in Michigan since day one for Geronimo. But we have a larger team that's in and out. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Oh, I hear an echo. Stephanie Doan.
Hi, good morning. I'm Stephanie Doan. I'm the Director of Government Relations with Southern Current. Southern Current is a large-scale solar and storage developer working in Michigan. We've been on the ground for the last 2.5 years. We have projects in very early stage of development and are looking to develop or invest about $500 million in the state. Thank you for having us.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Victoria.
Hi, Laura. Good morning. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the Commission for hosting this event. I'm Victoria Fleming. I represent NextEra Energy. We are the largest producer of renewable energy in the world, with operations across North America. With respect to Michigan, we have about 500. We've developed about 500 megawatts of wind, and we have a 1.3 megawatt solar project operational, looking to add to that and grow our solar portfolio in the state of Michigan as well. I've been with the company for about 7 years. I started in asset management and in fact managed the Tuscola wind projects as my first job at NextEra, and then since then have moved to origination for Michigan.
Great, thank you. Steve. Oh, I think you're muted, Steve.
How about now?
That's good.
Good. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for putting this panel together. I'm Steve Levitas. I'm the Senior Vice President for Regulatory and Government Affairs with Pinegate Renewables. We're a utility-scale solar developer based in Asheville, North Carolina, but Michigan is one of our most important markets. We have 300 plus megawatts of projects under contract with consumers, the first of which will turn on this year. We're really excited about that. And we have a significant additional pipeline in consumers and DTE territories. All of those projects are connected to the distribution and sub-transmission system. Just want to say a word about kind of my interest in competitive solicitation. It's a topic that I've been involved with for many years. I was heavily involved in transitioning North Carolina from a state that relied primarily on PURPA as its procurement model to a competitive solicitation program that our company's been an active participant in. I'm currently co-chairing a subcommittee in North Carolina on the future of competitive solicitation. and I was one of the principal architects of our National Trade Association's proposals on competitive solicitation in connection with FERC's PURPA rulemaking and PURPA reform. Delighted to be with you today.
Thanks, Steve. And last but not least, Danny.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, and thanks to the Commission for having us here this morning. My name is Danielle Shingala, and I serve as the General Counsel of Ranger Power. Ranger is a utility-scale solar development company, and we're focused on developing community-supported projects. Ranger has over 4 gigawatts under development throughout the Midwest, including nearly 300 megawatts currently under construction. Here in Michigan, we have several utility-scale solar projects, including the 239 megawatt Assembly Solar Project in Shiawassee County, which is currently under construction and is slated to be commissioned the first phase by the end of this year. Thank you.
Great, thank you guys. And I apologize. Maybe Jesse will jump in if my internet cuts out on me here. I seem to have it seems to be unstable this morning. So I'm going to run through questions. I'm not going to ask everybody to respond to every question. We panelists, and I want to make sure that folks respond to the ones they're most interested in. So we'll just ask folks to chime in, and if I haven't heard from someone in a while, I'll point to them. So just taking a step back, I'm hoping you all can hear me, and someone will tell me if they can't. Do you think all generation resources should be procured through a competitive process? Is this sort of the gold standard that we should be using for everything? Steve, you look like you want to say something. You start.
I'm looking at Stephanie too. We're both shaking our heads up and down. Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. You know, our traditionally in vertically integrated monopoly regimes, we had a very different approach to procurement, where the utility would come to commission, seek a certificate for approval, and then build an asset that then was placed in the rate base. And there are a lot of reasons why that approach is outmoded, most notably that generation is no longer a natural monopoly, and there's no reason that it should be procured differently from anything else in our economy. Very different from transmission and distribution. So competitive procurement, competitive solicitation, as with every other aspect of our free market economy, drives costs down, subjects ratepayers to lower risk, and stimulates innovation. So I see no reason why that shouldn't be the model going forward.
I'd like to add a little to that. I think now more than ever, there needs to be a lot more transparency and competition and planning, mostly because there's a lot more actors and stakeholders involved. We have industrial and commercial customers. We have independent power producers like us. We have advocates. There's so many more mechanisms in which to deploy these resources, and there are so many more resources and technologies available that single source or putting us into a certain category or box is really limiting the potential and thus the benefit that the multiple resources available to us can provide to the state, and the maximum public benefit we can a competitive procurement program can provide to ratepayers and to the state itself.
Yeah, Laura, just to add to that, I would agree with both of the original comments there, but just to add to that briefly is, you know, these new processes, the utilizing IRPs and the competitive procurement process only speeds up the transition to a carbon-free future in the country and the state of Michigan.
Great. Okay. It looks like no one else wants to add to that. So I think now digging into all source bidding, has anyone experienced or seen all source bidding work well? Sort of where is that, or you don't have to name the specific utility procurement process, but but what are the circumstances under which that's worked well that you've experienced? I don't know if Danny or Victoria wants to kick it off.
Sure, happy to, Laura. So in our opinion, all source bidding generally does not work well. And the reason for this is ultimately that we think it's helpful for the utility to identify what resources they're looking for, and then bidders can respond to that. Otherwise, we find ourselves in a situation where bidders may not be giving their most cost competitive and focused bids to the RFP. Because they're just not sure what ultimately the utility is looking to procure. So for utility or other third-party procurer to obtain kind of the most cost-effective best bids, we think it's helpful to identify specifically what resources they're looking for so that bidders can really put their best foot forward. These are incredibly time-intensive for bidders, so folks want to make sure that they're spending their time efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, I think the time piece of making sure that the developers are spending their time effectively, a lot goes into an offer, a lot of thinking, a lot of creativity, and I think just to, beyond just sort of all source and the question about all source, the providing us or guiding with us with enough flexibility for developers to demonstrate their creativity and thoughtfulness as to how to get a project that is the most economic, the most cost effective, the most solid, the most thoughtful. That really is, I think, sort of in my mind, a driving when you think about creating policy. We'd love it if you could provide enough flexibility to engage our creative thinking while not also spinning us up and unnecessarily providing offers that don't lead to transactions, right? So,
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I think that a conversation about the IRP needs to happen or can happen and should happen to define what all source bidding can be. And I think if you have a good conversation, a robust conversation in the IRP planning process, and that process drives the procurement plan or the procurement of resources, I think you can eliminate a lot of what Danielle and others were talking, and others talk about as far as pricing and certain discrepancies or unfairness. I don't think Danielle said that, but I've heard that from other people. I think it all comes back to what how a commission designs or guides rather the IRP process. And I think that's really a key we might want to talk about now, and that might help frame the all source bidding conversation a little bit more.
So I'm looking forward to talking to Danny offline to learn more about her concerns about all source procurement, because we're looking at that in the processes that I'm involved with. And I will tell you, I have not, my company's not participated in an all source procurement, so I can't tell you from personal experience what that's like. We've been the successful bidder in solar specific RFPs, so we've liked those and found those work. But I've had occasion to read a lot of literature on this subject, much of it from independent consultants who I would say are somewhat oriented towards promoting renewables deployment. And there seems to be a pretty broad consensus in this literature in support of all source procurement. I certainly don't want to see anybody wasting their time, as was mentioned, putting huge resources into responding to RFPs that aren't really going anywhere. But one of the big advantages that we've seen in the West is with respect to operational characteristics that require more dispatchability, more ability to serve at times of day when renewables may not be available. The all source model is resulting in solar plus storage and maybe wind as well, competing successfully where you would otherwise see gas being specified as the resource that's required. So we certainly want to see renewables have the opportunity to compete with gas where they can do so.
Yeah, thank you guys. This is really interesting. I want to see if I can ask a question that gets at what Stephanie's was talking about, and maybe circles around this. Is as part of the proposal, which I know a lot of folks on this call probably read, that Jesse put out, there's a series of ideas for how we structure the IRP process in terms of RFPs. And one of the new ideas, which I understand from staff, they think we could do according to the letter of the statute, is to have the utilities issue an RFI before the IRP. And that would, in theory, allow folks like you all to tell them what you have available without hopefully doing the amount of work required for an RFP. And then the utility could use that information, the numbers, to really effectively model what they need in terms of generation, because they now have really accurate information about what the market can provide right now in Michigan. And then that results in a post IRP, RFP, or RFPs, multiple, whatever they need, based on what that modeling shows them. I wonder, and I don't want to put Danny on the spot, but I wonder if you guys think that helps, if you guys think that sort of is what Stephanie's driving at in terms of like figuring out what we need and then doing an RFP that's more tailored in some respects, but is still sort of open to all sources, but you know what kind of thing you need. So I don't know, anybody want to respond there?
Yeah, I think you a couple thoughts. If the RFI has pricing in it, then you may or may not get a great view of the market. I mean, one of the things that I think the utilities should have is kind of their ear to the ground in terms of what's going on in the market, when best to transact, you know, where is solar pricing headed, where's battery storage pricing headed, trying to really seek to understand that. If you host an RFI that has pricing, you probably have a variety of developer responses in terms of incredibly aggressive, non-binding, right, or the other way where you're just kind of lobbing something in. So I don't know that it serves the purpose entirely of what I think you're looking for, which is sort of understanding where market trends are headed, but also allowing that transparency piece. So.
Sorry, Dave, did you want to?
No, I agree with that. I think what that really, it goes back to the IRP and how detailed and thoughtful the IRP is prior to being issued, so that still allowing flexibility for future technologies, but the more detailed and more specific an IRP is, the more the market can respond to it with creativity and new technology that's on the horizon, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to echo what Victoria's comments. I'm not a big fan of RFIs for price discovery. I think it's an unnecessary step for a couple of reasons. One is, as Victoria suggested, the pricing is not binding, and you may get really aggressive pricing, which kind of skews what the market really will bear. Second, I don't think the information that you get is significantly better than the massive amount of information that is available in our industry about pricing. We have so much information every day through all kinds of services about where pricing is. But most importantly, I think if you look at the Colorado model, which is often pointed to as the kind of leader in innovative approach to procurement, what they actually conduct a RFP after their planning process, and the planning process is not overly prescriptive, so that when the decisions are made about what's going to be procured, about the portfolio of resources and timing that's going to be procured, they actually have real cost information. And that to me seems like the best of all possible worlds, because what we've done historically, Stephanie and I are involved in this right now in South Carolina, you've got competing experts talking about the relative price of gas and solar and so forth. And the commission's got to try to figure out who's right, but there's no substitute for going into the market and getting binding pricing And then you know what the price is, and you can compare, resource A or portfolio A to an alternative, and there's no uncertainty with regard to cost and price.
So
Yeah.
that's interesting, Stephen. I think that sort of brings, we have a couple questions in the chat I want to make sure to get to, but one of them kind of reflects this, is how do utilities have their ear to the ground? And I think the concern is what you just raised, which is there's multiple competing experts telling you multiple competing things about pricing. Is there a problem then? I think staff, I understand at least, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but one of the ideas for having an RFI is an RFP, if it happens before an IRP, that's a 10-month case. So you're a long way out from actually procuring, actually starting that project. And I can imagine that might cause problems for you guys on your timelines. Any reactions to that, if an RFP is the way to go? Stephanie?
Well, I think that's the case for all sources. And, to go back a little bit to what Steve and Dave were saying, I mean, if a commission can define the need in broad terms and some attributes about the load and look at the resources as a whole, right? And then you're procuring for that load or for that portfolio. And then you're going out not necessarily for a specific source, you're going out to fulfill the need of that portfolio. So it doesn't necessarily, you're going to get the market value of the resource at that certain time. It might not necessarily be a certain solar resource or something, but you're going to have a broader sense of what's out there, what's the most competitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess a follow-up, and Danny, this is in the chat to you specifically. When you're looking at all sorts of RFPs that you've seen, are there some that do well what Stephanie just sort of outlined, that there's a resource characteristics, or that the sort of type of thing the utility is looking for that can solve some of the concerns you brought up front? I think you're muted. I think if you're on your phone, there's a special code you have to hit. Maybe Jesse can tell us. There you go.
Star 6 on the phone will unmute you.
There you are. Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Sorry, I seem to have some connectivity issues. Let me hang that up. So it depends, Laura. We've seen both. So we've seen some instances where, and oftentimes these will be, for example, large C&I customers who are going out to bid because they want to have some sort of resource. Other times it's utilities who don't identify exactly what they're looking for, but they're really looking for lowest price, I think, at the end of the day. And that's where I think we get into this situation where we can't put our best foot forward because it's not worth, to Victoria's point, it's not worth all the time and effort. These bids are incredibly complex. There's a lot of energy and time that goes into putting together a thoughtful bid. And we just haven't seen anyone do it well when they do an all-source bid that really incents us to put forward our best pricing and our best proposal. And I apologize, I got disconnected for a little bit, so I came in on the end of whether we have an RFI before an IRP. In our opinion, kind of the same issue. Are you really getting a bidder's best pricing, or are we kind of maybe either inappropriately inflating the market or inappropriately driving it down? So it's not, in our opinion, a great data point for utilities to go into an IRP process with. So again, identifying the need, and I think, Stephanie, to your point, oftentimes based on the characteristics of what a utility is looking for, they kind of know what resource, that drives what resource they're looking for. So I think that gives us the answer in not all instances, but in a lot where there are utilities after capacity. Solar, for example, could really fill that need. And so identifying the resources through that process is helpful for bidders to come forward in an RFP, put their best foot forward, have real-time market data, and have a utility make a decision based on that.
Okay. Great.
Laura, I just
yeah,
wanted to
go
add
ahead, Jake.
just a quick comment. Throughout all of these processes, we have dynamic forces and static forces that are at play. Example, political issues, legislative issues here in the state, litigation that's ongoing, tariff threats, those kind of things that we all have to deal with that are lengthy and time consuming. So trying to put our best foot forward with the process is managing a lot of that internally, trying to figure out what is the best product that we can put forth. If we just had a static market, that'd be very simple and very easy to do, but there's so many dynamic forces at play at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to move on to the next section, but if we have time, we can come back. I could ask questions all day. So
Laura,
just to make sure we get through. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, this is Meredith. I have a couple questions in the chat. Do you want me to wait till the end of the panel?
No, I'm asking them. I asked both of those.
Oh,
okay.
Did you?
Yep,
okay, sorry.
I'll keep doing it. I'll keep pulling them in.
My internet's been cutting out, so okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no problem. I'm not reading them word for word, but I think we did touch on both of those. So keep putting them in the chat. And I apologize if I'm not reading them straight out, but I am getting them in. So
I don't know if the rain's given everybody internet problems today, but I've had some audio issues, so thank you.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so the second topic that we were asked to cover is how the review process, so review of RFPs, how bidding works, sort of the evaluation process in general. And I think sort of top line, big picture question is whether you think regulated utilities and their affiliates should be allowed to participate in competitive solicitations in the competitive procurement process. And I've got some sub questions, but maybe we'll just start off with that. And if that is the case, what kind of guardrails do you think we need to have in place? Who wants to go? I'm sure everybody has an opinion on this one.
Well, Victoria,
go ahead.
About affiliates of regulated utilities, but I'll just say that's such a big topic. One thing that I think has to be included in that conversation is how they participate and what the form of cost recovery is. So in North Carolina, in our competitive procurement program, the utility and its affiliates have been allowed to participate, but they participate in the same way that independent power producers do, which is that they bid on a term contract basis, in our case 20 years, and they get paid every year just the way we do. They get paid for the generation that they produce. They do not rate base the asset. And I don't know any way that you can compete a rate-based asset against a competitively bid PPA type asset. So that's an important question. And of course, I know a number of people from consumers are on the line, and Laura, you and others were involved with the consumers IRP, where and you see this in other places like the recent Virginia legislation, where there's an allocation made between PPA procurement and utility procurement, and that utility procurement ideally would be competitively bid as well through a bid own transfer process. In terms of the question you asked, I'm not categorically opposed to utility participation as long as it's structured properly.
I would just say, I would add to that the way that it's structured ought to serve, number one, creative thinking, diversity of offers, and a blended approach that serves the ratepayer, that to Steve's point, understands how that's all analyzed and compared versus PPAs. But in general, it's you can strike a good chord there.
I like Victoria's answer. I think that the purpose is for us to do business with you. We want to do business, and we don't want to put up walls or barriers that will prevent that. So whatever we can do to structure it so that we can be creative and at the end of the day, deploy these resources is what I think is most important.
Laura, it's worth mentioning, if I just say something else, that we had extensive conversations in the consumer's IRP about the importance to ratepayers of the utility continuing to own generation assets, or alternatively to receive additional compensation has been allowed by statute and by the commission for PPA procurement. So we may disagree about the details of that or how that should be done, but I recognize that there are arguments to be made in terms of cost of capital, utility balance sheet, and what that means for ratepayers in terms of the utility's participation in generation, especially if they're being asked to retire a lot of existing coal assets.
Great. Thank you, guys. That's really helpful starting point there. Moving on to after the bid process starts, I think another key question that's posed sort of by the staff straw man is what is the role for third-party review? And that's potentially both, that's potentially both an independent evaluator, but we can get into that in a minute, but also, third-party stakeholders who, are not participating. So are there circumstances under which third-party review of bids is appropriate? And maybe which third parties, if that is ever appropriate? I don't know if Danny wants to start on this one.
Sure, happy to, Laura. So we think that, and I know we're going to hit on the subject in a little bit, but having a third-party independent evaluator help support a utility in an RFP is appropriate, and that third-party evaluator should have access to all of the bid information. Relatedly, NPSC staff, of course, should have access to all of that bid information, but we do not think it's appropriate that other third parties have access to the full bid information. And it's really just comes down to competitively sensitive information. Ultimately, this is the most kind of proprietary information of any developer as we put together bids. And with an independent evaluator participating in this process, we don't see the need of any other third party to have access to that information, even if they are under an NDA or whatnot. Still don't think it's an appropriate kind of sharing of that information.
I would concur with Danielle's comments regarding that. As far as the actual independent third party, I think we feel that specifically to one that's utilizing or that's being utilized right now, that there were some initial concerns in last year's IRP as far as, is there a firewall, considering the parent company is a competitor in the industry, that caused us concerns. Doesn't seem to be as big of an issue this year as it did last year. So,
Laura, it's important to differentiate between what I refer to and others do as an independent administrator versus an independent evaluator. I think the distinction being that an independent administrator actually runs the process, ranks the bids, makes the decision about who's going to get the awards, and then the utility contracts with that party, whereas an independent evaluator is advising, overseeing, playing some role in connection with the utility as the ultimate decision maker. And the first thing to say about that distinction to our earlier question is, if the utility and its affiliates are going to participate as a market participant and potentially be awarded a contract, I feel very strongly that you have to have an independent party making the decision about who wins. You can't have the utility making a decision to award a contract to itself. If the utility is not participating, or if, as is the case with the consumer's IRP, you segregate out the PPAs and the utility's not participating in that part from the utility utility ownership portion of the procurement, maybe the answer is a little different. And then just one thing on the issue of other third parties. I generally agree with what's been said on that. I think where you have defined the procurement of exactly what's going to be procured, I certainly agree with that. I'm not sure exactly how it works in Colorado, but where you have the commission making a decision to approve a portfolio after an RFP, I think it's, as with any commission proceeding, I think it would be difficult to impossible to say that interested parties don't have a right to participate in that proceeding. And I suspect that is what happens in Colorado, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay, that's great. We got a couple questions in the chat that I want to get to, and I apologize, I didn't see Jesse's question in time, so this goes back a little bit, but I think it was Steve, you were talking about you were implying the financial compensation mechanism and how that in the consumer's IRP, there's now the 50-50 split between resources that are PPAs with an FCM and utility ownership. Does that ability to have an FCM, which consumers has taken advantage of, help deal with the issue of utility ownership versus and affiliates participating versus PPAs?
Well, with the qualification that I don't necessarily agree with, or I should say, there's a lot of room for discussion about where you should go with an FCM, but it is certainly one mechanism for addressing the legitimate concerns about the impact on the utility balance sheet, cost of capital, and so forth of transitioning to a full PPA regime. I mean, I think the other tools are, and these were discussed, I think, in the consumer's IRP proceeding, you could increase the utility's rate of return on the assets that it does own. You could provide for more utility ownership, the split. So I think it was roughly 50-50 in Michigan. Virginia just passed comprehensive legislation that provides, generally speaking, for 65% utility ownership of the procurement, 35% PPA. So there are a variety of tools to address what I'm acknowledging is legitimate concern. FCM is certainly one of them.
Okay. And this is an interesting question that came up too in the staff proposal. There's a proposal or an idea that a separate administrator could be hired by staff to go in afterwards, or separate evaluator, I'm sorry, if the utility had an evaluator or administrator. And it's I'm not exactly sure the role of that group has been spelled out in their proposal, but a question: could the Public Service Commission staff act in the role of independent evaluator? And I know everybody may not agree on, as Steve has said, whether this should be an independent administrator or an evaluator, but could the staff act in that role? Anyone have thoughts? Stephanie, did you?
No, I'm just thinking of not should. I don't know why they would need to. I mean, I think if you have I think an independent evaluator, if one is chosen and approved that's doing their job, I don't know that that's a necessary step or process. But I guess I was just trying to process the question as you were asking it. I don't know that that's necessary, I guess. I believe they are capable of doing it. I'm not sure that it's necessary, I guess, is my answer.
Yeah, Laura, I'd agree with Stephanie on, I think they could. I do think it's helpful to have the commission staff serve as kind of a check on the evaluator and the utility as well. So I think we get a lot of value of having this independent evaluator and the utility evaluating the bids, and then having the MPSC staff serve as another check to make sure that we're implementing best practices. There is transparency in the process. The right resources are being selected, things like that. So I think it could work, but I think there's value in having both checks on that process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's see, I guess digging in a little bit on the, I think most people said other third parties shouldn't have access. There's a part of the proposal is that non-competitors, and I don't know how that would be defined, could have access if they signed NDAs. Any reactions? Does that solve anything? Are we still in the same place where they really shouldn't have access? Victoria, I don't know if I don't want to put people on the spot if they don't have thoughts. Dave, go ahead.
I don't have a strong, I think my thought is, I'm not sure what that does for the process. But to, a lot of times too, when you have, there's a lot of moving parts, like we talked about in a bid, panel price assumptions, land assumptions, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into building the project and pulling in an offer. And so to the extent that this process goes for an exorbitant amount of time, you lose sort of the realness of, or the freshness of that bid. That's my thought.
Yeah, I would. My thoughts on that are, is this the appropriate place for non-competitors to participate and potentially raise issues or cause issues with the process, only delaying the process even further? These, as Victoria has said and the others have agreed, these require a lot of work, a lot of man hours, a lot of time, a lot of meetings, discussions, so on and so forth, lead time for procurement, those kind of issues, that then having a third party non-competitor intervene in the process at this particular stage, I wouldn't think is appropriate. Potentially after, maybe at the point where contracts are being discussed at the Public Service Commission level and getting the stamp of approval from, the commission is probably a more appropriate place, which I believe they have that right now, the ability to do that.
Sorry, having trouble getting off mute here. So another question from the chat, which perfect. Jesse's sensing all of my questions. Although there may not be complete agreement, it seems to be that folks are interested or supportive of either an independent evaluator or an independent administrator. So is there a general consensus that an independent evaluator or an independent administrator is preferred to having full utility administration of the competitive procurement process? And if not, under what circumstances? So I see Victoria shaking her head. Do you want to start? Oh, and you're muted. Uh-oh, can't get off mute. Anyone else?
I'm happy.
Go ahead, Danny.
Okay, I made it back.
You figured it.
Sorry, Danny, go ahead.
Sure. Well, just to start, I think that there is a big distinction between how we're defining an independent evaluator versus an independent administrator. So interested in commission staff's thoughts on this, but from our view, an independent evaluator is someone who helps facilitate the RFP, kind of reviews the initial bids and helps organize the information and try to compare bidders to aid the utility in ultimately making its decision, versus an independent administrator, which, for example, Consumers Energy is using now for their RFP, where they really run the whole process on behalf of the utility. So I think those are kind of distinct concepts and are worth kind of taking one by one. So from our perspective, we are supportive of an independent evaluator, but we are not supportive of an independent administrator. And the reason is I think as much as we would like to break out these projects into kind of numerical values of how we can weight them, at the end of the day, that just doesn't reflect the reality and kind of the complexities of these projects that we're bidding. There's lots of aspects to these projects, and there's a lot of non-price factors that should be considered, because at the end of the day, they're important not only for the communities in which we're building our projects, but also in terms of de-risking the asset and making sure that the bid that's being proposed can actually be constructed, because that ultimately is in the best interest of the utility, of the developer, and of the Michigan ratepayer. So I think that we can try to certainly schedule out and create weighting tables to evaluate each of those factors, but I just don't think it's a perfect science, and those are really valuable aspects of a project that sometimes can be lost if there's an independent administrator, because that can't be necessarily translated to the utility. Last point on this, these are long-term relationships with utility and developer counterparties. For example, for a PPA, you might be working together for the next 20, 25, hopefully longer years. We think that it's appropriate for a utility to be able to also weigh in on who they want to work with long-term, to what extent they've had success or think they can get there on contract negotiations, because those can be a really lengthy process, which are really time intensive and resource intensive for both utilities and developers. So getting there, I think there's just a lot of soft qualities that the utility is ultimately in the best position to make. I'll stop there, but thank you.
I'll echo everything Danny just said. I think those were some really, really key points, really well said. I think to add on to that, I think you have to weigh how prescriptive you want to be in this process, because as Danny said, it speaks to bringing our creativity. If everything looks non-conforming, you're going to get a very dry, very one-note response that isn't going to deploy the developer's creativity and thoughtfulness around how to de-risk the project and how to get the best price. And so I would keep that in mind when we talk about this. The overall process is, if everything looks non-conforming and you're overly prescriptive, I think we've missed the mark on behalf of the ratepayers.
So this is another one that I look forward to talking to Danny and I guess Victoria too offline about. I'll just report that the development community in both of the Carolinas has been, I think, pretty unanimously of the view that the independent administrator model was the better way to go. And I guess, at least one of the reasons is because we have had utility participation. So I don't know if your view is the same, where the utility is a market participant, utility and its affiliates. That would seem, as I said before, pretty problematic. But assuming that's not the case, I think there's a better conversation to be had. Although I think another concern that I've heard expressed by developers is just the idea, to your point about relationships. Yeah, that's a good thing, but it also creates the potential of sort of playing favorites and cutting other folks out of the market. So I don't know how you evaluate that. But one thing I did want to say very specifically in response to something that Danny said about the complexity of contract negotiations, I am very strongly of the view that RFPs should be bid against a pre-approved form contract and not have pricing come in and then have parties negotiate on hugely important consequential terms and conditions in a contract that have a huge bearing on price. So, as an example, one developer bids $35 a megawatt hour, another bids $38 a megawatt hour. The $35 bid is based on an assumption that there's going to be minimal performance security or some allocation of risk. The 38 is based on something different. You can't compare apples to apples if you have a total free-for-all on all the non-price terms and conditions.
Steve, I'm gonna push you on that point a little bit, and we can talk about this offline. But on the contract negotiation point specifically, I think it's a balanced approach we need, right? I think there needs to be a basic level of shared assumptions. So you mentioned developed security. That's a great example, right? All of the bidders should understand what development security or operational security is expected, and that should be an input in the pricing that they submit to the utility. However, these contracts are lengthy, long-term agreements in a PPA or incredibly complex development and construction agreements with respect to BTAs. And I think that if we required a specific form with no negotiation, we're leaving value on the table. It goes to Victoria's point about kind of the creativity. Certain developers might be able to accept certain provisions and not live with others. And maybe those are okay to the utility and maybe they're not. But I think if we force all bidders to conform to exactly the same contract, the result's gonna be a lot higher pricing. Because if a developer thinks, okay, I have to agree to this, and there's no room to negotiate it, even though we can create more value for the utility, the ratepayer, and the developer here, then we're just gonna, I think, get to a result that nobody wants. So understanding what provisions are non-negotiable from a utility standpoint is very helpful. And then giving developers an opportunity to work with the utility to find what's the contract that creates the most value here for all interested parties, I think is actually a really helpful mechanism in an RFP process.
So you guys have done a wonderful job of taking me into the next section. So I don't even need to, we've already started, which is great because we're a little tiny bit behind time. Let's talk more about this contract negotiation process. And so this third section is what's the required information that should be presented in an RFP. I know in our prior conversations, I understand that the markup of a contract, proposed contract, is very long, lengthy. These are very long contracts. It's very complicated. And there may be a situation where asking you go, no go on certain terms you might be okay with one if you got two others, but you're not okay with it if you don't get the other two. Are there ways that you've seen that work well in other places? You know, Danny, I think you just pointed out provisions that are non-negotiable. Maybe that could be explained to bidders. What else? What are the other ways that you've seen that process work well? I don't know if Stephanie, you want to, I don't want to put you on the spot. We can start with someone else. Anyone want to, or go ahead. Yeah.
No, you can go with someone else.
Hey, Laura, let me just mention one thing that maybe ought to be on the table, and maybe staff or others, I don't know if anybody here bid into the DTE Renewable Energy Plan RFP. We did not, so I'm not familiar with the details, but my recollection is that there was the opportunity to propose modifications on non-price terms, and that the scoring evaluated bids based on the cost of modifications to the proposed contract terms that were made by bidders. I'm not sure how well that worked. You know, we were in that proceeding. It seemed like it created a little bit of uncertainty or potential for disagreement about how that evaluation was done, but I wasn't close enough to know for sure. But that would be a good reference point to see how that worked in DTE. But I do think I'm interested, and again, we can do this offline. I'm interested in hearing more from Danny about what would be an example of a term that would not be specified, that would have a material impact on price that might be subject to negotiation. I was thinking, for example, about a performance guarantee. I mean, Danny, do you think that the sort of minimum output guarantee is something that should be specified as a fixed term that everybody bids against, or subject to negotiation?
So on that, Steve, do you mean the concept of having a performance guarantee in a PPA, or what the specific performance guarantee is? Because I think those are very different questions.
I mean the latter, so a minimum output guarantee. So you're building a 50 megawatt project, and you say we're estimating that it's going to produce this many megawatt hours per year, and you know what's the point at which usually it's not 100% guarantee, but I've seen anywhere from 70 to 90, and liquidated damages amounts associated with failure to hit those numbers. And so I'm just curious if that's something that you think ought to be specified so everybody bids against the same expectation, or if that should be negotiated as a trade-off against price, because it certainly affects price.
Yeah, it's a great example. So I think in an instance like that, if the utility said, this is a performance guarantee is a required provision of this PPA, and a performance guarantee at, let's just make up a number, 85% is the required performance guarantee, and the damages, the LDs, if you don't meet this, are whatever dollar amount, non-negotiable. That is information that the bidders should incorporate into their bid price and not expect to be able to negotiate that provision, because the utility's been very clear about it. So I think those kind of really strict compensation and financial terms of a contract, I think, are the easy ones to say, we're open to negotiation, we're not open to negotiation, because that's just a number game ultimately, right, to affect your bid price. I think what gets a little more challenging are kind of the other softer provisions. Ultimately, it all comes down to money, kind of the allocation of risk between the parties. But I think there are other provisions that can be tweaked or modified or expanded to create, like I'm saying, more value under a contract that just aren't black and white. This is $5, this is $3 kind of situation. But I think it's very, very helpful to your point. I totally agree with you that making sure bidders understand those set numbers and whether a utility is willing to negotiate those is key, because then they can properly evaluate the bid and the price that they get.
Just, another one to throw out there that's really something Stephanie and I deal with a lot is dispatchability and curtailment. Is that something that is defined the same way for everybody, or do you have the potential to negotiate how much curtailment is going to be allowed and what impact that has on price?
Yeah.
So I don't have to answer that. I'm just really trying to highlight examples of the kinds of issues that in the kind of debate between me and Danny, it would have to either be fixed or subject to negotiation.
I guess I'm just wondering, it seems to me with this discussion that the independent administrator could eliminate a lot of back and forth. And I'm going to go back to my IRP spiel again in creating the procurements process. I think if a lot of this is addressed in the beginning, then it might not, then a lot of these negotiables or non-negotiables could be determined perhaps. I'm just hearing a lot of time. We're talking about a lot of time it takes to do these bids. And I think it can be, there are places where we could streamline this process and make it as transparent as possible, and create a win for developers and for utilities and for ratepayers as well. I think that's just more of an observation than a question or a recommendation.
Yeah, Laura, I concur with many of the thoughts here that, everything we do is risk mitigation, and identifying those issues early in the RFP or the competitive bid process and mitigating risk up at the front lets us as the participants know where we stand and how we can be creative and compete financially. There's in this specific RFP that's going on right now, there's some unknowns that are that we have to take risk on. Interconnection issues, those kind of things that are need to be addressed up front, and how they're going to be addressed a little clearer than what they are now. But it's all about risk mitigation, and anything that can be, if a utility says, okay, this is our defined parameters on liquidated damages, on curtailment, so on and so forth, that's great. Then we're all on the same level playing field. And it comes down just to our internal pricing and our structure on how we do things internally.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So kind of teeing off that, and something we talked a little bit about earlier, for the sort of non-price factors that get put into these decisions, what do you need to know? I think there's a difference of whether the utility has more discretion or it's an independent administrator. We've talked about that, but if the utility does want to tell you some sort of a weighting, a list, a structure, what kind of things do you think are necessary to provide for bidders so you all have the right knowledge going in? Danny, did you want to start?
Sure, happy to hop in here. So I think as a developer that spends a lot of time on making sure that our projects are community supported, we think that these non-price factors are very important. And I think it's a hard question to say specifically, how do we assign a numerical value to each of these and how do we weight each of these? I think it's definitely a worthwhile exercise to have. I'm not sure how perfectly we can do that. Because again, at the end of the day, we don't want to leave value on the table for a developer, the utility, the ratepayer. So things like, what is a developer's experience in the state? What is their track record of success? When they promise you a project, are they going to deliver on it? So all of these things, community outreach and community support, the maturity of the project, where it is in the permitting process, all of these factors all go to de-risking the asset, which ultimately the utility is, I won't put words in their mouth, probably looking for, because that means that it's a higher likelihood that when they sign a contract with you, the project's going to come forward, achieving everyone's objectives here. So I think that these non-price factors are really important, though I think it's somewhat of a fiction to think that we can perfectly assign a numerical value to them and weight them in this process. And that's why I think an independent evaluator is very helpful. They can organize these, they can try to compare them across bids, but ultimately there's not just a perfect number that can be assigned to them to just compare them kind of apples to apples. And I think it goes back to Victoria's point about kind of the creativity of a bid. Like, we don't want to lose that in this process because that brings value to everyone. So really emphasizing those and de-risking the asset with some of these other soft factors are important and should definitely be considered as part of the process.
Yeah, you could probably guess. I won't say the word creativity because I feel like I've said it 1,000 times. But if you provide the transparency with which a utility is going to go ahead and examine us, I won't say wait or evaluate, but examine us and demonstrate those interests early on, so that we can start to form a project, perhaps on brownfield, or something like that, some component that as Danny said may or may not have a price factor or a drive to the lowest price, but is incredibly important on behalf of customers. So that kind of transparency, those kinds of guardrails are really, really helpful. I would also add helping us understand how your levelized cost of energy, how you're going to look at us and evaluate us from that standpoint. That's incredibly helpful. But I agree that I think if you get overly prescriptive and provide us exact, 12% weighting over here and that kind of thing, it is a little bit of a false sense of security or false sense of evaluation that I'm not sure. You're probably not going to have in an RFP in sort of a response effort.
Anyone else like to add to that one? Okay. Let's see. I know we're coming to the end of our time. We probably have time for one more question. I don't know if anyone else, if there's, I think, Jesse, you could tell me how to do this, but if folks want to pipe in and ask a question, I don't know how to see the raised hands or allow people on the phones, but happy to do that if there's a last question.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm not seeing any raised hands and I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So I'll make one comment. So this was great. So thank you all so much. Laura, especially Laura, made my job easy and was able to get Steve and Stephanie and Victoria and Danielle and Dave all together for me. So I can't take any of the credit here. Laura, again, thank you guys so much, and thank you for everything that we did. We have a lot to think about as we go forward, especially with the straw proposal, where comments are due at the end of this month. But the one thing that I did see is that I get it now. It's as easy as eliminating all risk for the developers and eliminating all risk for the utilities. It's that simple. So I don't know why we're even having this conversation anymore. We just have to figure out how to do that. So we'll go ahead.
You get a prize if you can do that.
So we can go ahead and open it up to the phones now. Remember to take yourself off of mute. You hit *6. Any questions on the phone? Last chance for any questions through the chat or raising your hand.
This is Dave. I just have a comment. I'm very curious to hear the utilities' perspective now that they've heard us going forward. And sadly, I've got to drop, so I'm looking forward to this recording.
It was an interesting thought process trying to figure out who should go first, whether it be the developers or the utilities. And I don't know if there's some strategery to that. or if it's just how it worked out. But yeah, so it will be interesting. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. This was great. I learned a lot, and thank you for trying to answer all my hard, complex questions as well through the chat function. Laura, again, thank you for moderating this panel, and I really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks to the
Thank
staff
you.
for all your work. Thank
Thank
you all
you
Thanks,
very
very
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. We're going to have Indiana Michigan Power Company go first. Interesting discussion there, another bit of strategery. Just because of the way we've always done things, the trying to figure out who goes first in this when you have a consumers, a DTE, and an I&M presentation all in line, and we decided to change things up a little bit. Usually consumers, DTE, and then I&M would go. But we're going to have I&M go first, just to make things a little more interesting. Is everyone able to see I&M's presentation here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And excuse me. And Andrew, are you ready to go?
Yeah, can you hear me, Jesse?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you. Perfect. So I'm going to keep the screen as it is here, just because if I put it into the full screen mode, I lose control of my mute button, and I definitely want to be able to mute myself because of kids being at home and yappy dogs. So I hope everyone's okay with us looking at the presentation this way. With that being said, Andrew, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. And I just want to say that I thought that was a great panel to start things off with. I&M is certainly looking forward to participating in this process and sharing our experience and perspective and learning and hearing all the perspectives of others, and also exploring what opportunities may be gained to continue to improve in these areas. I just want to provide a short introduction to I&M and discuss some unique aspects of our business that come into play with respect to planning and procurement. And in addition, Joe Karish, who is the Director of Renewable Energy Development, who has more than 30 years of experience with AEP and includes managing power plant operations and more than a decade of experience conducting RFPs, will be discussing most of the matters relative to this topic. Jesse, if you want to go to slide 2, please. So just as a quick introduction to I&M, we are a multi-jurisdictional company with approximately 600,000 retail customers, 130,000 of which are located in Southwest Michigan. And we also have nearly 400 megawatt of wholesale loads served under long-term full requirements generation agreements. We're also fully integrated, owning or purchasing about 5,400 megawatt of nameplate generation with a very robust transmission system. And as I mentioned, we're part of the system and a member of PJM. And being part of AEP really provides a lot of benefits to our customers, and being part of a more expansive transmission system in PJM, which has little constraint or congestion. And it also leverages a significant amount of resources and experience in the area of competitive procurement, is a great example of that. And additionally, I&M is an FRR, or fixed resource requirement entity in PJM, which means that we self-supply our capacity to meet our load obligation rather than buy that from the market. And at the end of the day, that lowers our overall reserve requirement and cost of providing capacity to our customers. If you'll go to slide 3, please. So the picture on this slide depicts I&M's system and all of the resources we have to meet our load obligations and customer needs. And it consists of a diverse mix of nuclear, coal, renewables, and also a large amount of demand response load that's under customer contracts. And just as a side point, in 2019, more than 70% of our energy was carbon free. And when you look just specifically at the state of Michigan, I&M's generation resources are actually 100% carbon free. That is supported by the 2,300 megawatt Cook nuclear plant in Bridgman, Michigan, as well as 4 run-of-the-river hydro facilities and a universal solar facility located in Waterville. Additionally, I&M and AEP have been conducting integrated resource plans and utilizing competitive bidding for decades. And Joe is going to be covering a lot more of the competitive bidding process and experience in more detail. So why is what's the point of all that background? Well, there are some key considerations as we explore these topics, and some that are unique to I&M. We utilize a system-wide approach when it comes to generation resources, and that allows us to provide our customers with the greatest benefits of being part of a larger whole, which enables greater resource diversity for our customers, economies of scale, and also lowers cost. In being part of 2 retail jurisdictions, we are subject to different IRP frameworks in both. And at the end of the day, I&M's customers benefit the most when I&M has the flexibility to manage its business and balance the interests of those jurisdictions. And this is really the driving force behind the statutory language in Michigan related to integrated resource planning that's specific to multi-state companies. The situation is unique because to the extent that we have the flexibility, that to the extent the flexibility available to us doesn't allow us to successfully manage and balance those interests, the alternative may be to acquire resources specific to each state, which significantly complicates not only the regulatory process and rate making, but also, more importantly, risk disadvantage our customers. And our goal is and always has been to manage the business for the greatest benefit of all of our customers. We've been using an IRP as a planning tool for, as I mentioned earlier, for decades, and it's a very useful tool, and it is a true all-source review. And we strive to use the best pricing inputs available and evaluate those through a robust stakeholder process. However, the IRP itself does have its limitations. One being that it's a snapshot in time, another being that there's a significant time frame involved with the IRP. It could span anywhere from 2 to 3 years, depending on the jurisdiction that we would be considering. And this can be really problematic for bidders to provide exclusive fixed price purchase options for such a significant period of time. I think this was discussed earlier in the panel. Also in Indiana, the IRP is not approved, nor does it result in approval of new resources. Indiana follows much the same process as Michigan has with its certificate of need proceedings. When it comes to binding RFPs, those should really be structured consistent with each company's needs and intent. Those may be source specific, and that could be due to corporate sustainability commitments, state renewable portfolio standards like we have in Michigan, and other matters. And we shouldn't be issuing a binding RFP if it isn't a need or intent to purchase. I think that was a theme that was discussed previously, and we would agree with that. Because a big concern there is that damages our credibility and reputation. And really the goal at the end of the day with the RFP process is to get the most accurate and true pricing, most competitive pricing available to meet our needs. Which benefits our customers the most. And then bidders, as mentioned earlier, they invest a significant amount of time and resources in the process, and they're also providing exclusive options, which is an important aspect of that. So it's important that companies have the ability to strategically time RFPs. One, so we can time the market with project availability. There was a lot of discussion earlier about having our ears to the ground, and that's certainly something that we do as a business. And there are a limited number of projects that are out there, and being able to time RFPs to take advantage of those is really important, as opposed to mandating an RFP to be conducted at a certain point in time. It also allows us to optimize tax benefits and also time the resource acquisition process with the needs. I&M and AEP, we both have significant experience or past experience with independent monitors, and there are certainly times where using them makes a lot of sense. However, as we explore the topic, we also must consider the need and the associated cost. And what I mean by that is when you consider RFPs, not all RFPs are the same. And that's something that should be considered, I think, with determining whether independent monitor is something that is necessary. Also, we have a really robust process in place today. And I think that that's similar to the other utilities who are issuing RFPs to meet their resources. And that needs to be a consideration as well. If the process works well today, we should consider the old adage, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But certainly when it comes to independent monitors, as I said, it's not something that we're opposed to by any means. There is a value to that process, but a one-size-fits-all approach, we don't believe makes the most sense with respect to that topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and he's going to talk more about the RFP process itself.
Jesse, can you hear me okay?
Yep, Joe, you sound loud and clear. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jesse, and thanks for the invitation. Anytime I get an opportunity to learn from others, always pick something up. So this is good. And Andrew, thank you. Like Andrew said, my name is Joe Carish. I work for American Electric Power Service Corporation in Columbus, and we support all the operating companies as it relates to renewable energy, especially the large purchases. We've over the years, we've had 4,200 megawatts of renewable resources acquired or purchased via power purchase agreement via RFPs. And all of those were approved by various commissions across all the AEP operating company states, including Indiana and Michigan. And if you see the table there, I&M's approved projects, there's 4 large wind projects that have been approved over the years. Those were the result of competitive RFPs that were brought forth to the commissions for approval and approved. And then you have the Clean Energy Solar Pilot Project, which is a 15 megawatt solar project, consists of 4 facilities that was approved. That is an ownership. And then you have the St. Joe's solar farm in the South Bend area, a 20 megawatt project that's currently under construction and expected to achieve commercial operation at the end of the first quarter. We're pretty excited about that project. So I&M's portfolio there is 485 megawatts, again, all approved by the commissions via the RFP processes. And the RFP processes that we use for I&M are very similar, fundamentally the same as the RFPs across all of our operating companies. And these RFPs do change over time as we learn from the processes, as we learn from developers. So today, I'll be listening to others trying to improve our process. And the key thing I'm trying to improve in our process is the timeline. And you have your RFP process, and you get into contract negotiations, and then you're into the regulatory process, which could take 7 months, 9 months, in some of our operating companies up to a year. So anything we can do to help compress that time not only helps us, it helps the developer as well. Because once they bid into an RFP and we execute a contract, that project's off the table. They can't sell that project to anybody else. So they basically are giving us, as much as I hate to say it, a free option until we get through the regulatory process. So it's only prudent to try to improve these processes and compress that time frame. So the lower table shows all the projects, 4,280 megawatts across all of our operating companies. You can see the number of projects and the multitude of states and RTOs, east and west. The inset to the right, Appalachian Power. We currently have 2 RFPs going on with APCO, a 200 megawatt solar RFP for a dedicated Virginia resource, and a 50 megawatt solar RFP dedicated to a West Virginia resource. In Virginia, this year they approved the Virginia Clean Energy Act, or Economy Act, basically an RPS. And Virginia's getting pretty aggressive with his goals regarding renewables and going away from carbon type resources. As you can see in the inset there, 30% carbon free by 2030, and then 100% by 2050. Also a part of that RPS is a requirement for annual RFPs. So we'll be in the RFP business every year in Virginia for APCO. And as a side note, APCO in Virginia, they do not require an independent monitor. So, but we're confident in our processes. They're proven, and they've been approved, as you can see, by the number of megawatts here. Next slide, please. So here's a map showing all the renewable projects. It does show the hydro projects as well, which were older projects, are probably not a part of an RFP. But you can see the wind and solar resources across all the various states and RTOs. Looking down in Oklahoma, we have new wind pending. 3 projects, our North Central wind facilities, 1,485 megawatts approved just this year that we're moving forward with. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. And we also have the South Bend, or the St. Joe's solar farm up there in Northwest Indiana. It's under construction. And then in Virginia, we have a 15 megawatt project that's under development for commercial operation next year. So we've got a lot of activity going on. And as you can see by the map, we've participated with a lot of commissions, a lot of RFPs across many states, and we've been very successful. We haven't always been successful. There's a couple wind projects a few years ago in Virginia and West Virginia that were denied, and but it wasn't because of the RFP process. It was because of a pushback on economics. But the RFP process, withheld the scrutiny of the commissions, and they understand we have a solid process. Next slide, please. So here's a slide on the big wind project out west, Traverse, Maverick, and Sundance, nearly 1,500 megawatts, $2 billion in investment, which were approved by Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Texas denied this project. And once Texas denied the project, Arkansas and Louisiana picked up Texas's share of the project. So we were successful in getting these projects approved. Sundance has started construction. The other 2 projects will have a COD a little bit later than Sundance. And these projects are co-owned by SWEPCO and PSO. Excuse me. In Oklahoma, there is a state law requiring an independent evaluator. So when we went through the RFP process, the independent evaluator is involved with the development of the RFP. And when I say development, we draft the RFP, and he would provide some input. He was there for the bid opening. Same day, he got electronic copies of everything that we received, and he went on his way to do his evaluation. The independent evaluator was hired by the commission in Oklahoma. He was not hired by the company. So basically, he was doing his analysis on behalf of the Oklahoma State Corporation Commission and its staff. So we worked with the IE throughout the process. We implement processes to make sure he's up to date on what's going on. He has the material, and also we educate him on our process, our evaluation, and our approach to things. So there's a lot of open communication. It does take time, and like I said earlier, we're concerned about the times of the process. So it does take time. It does cost money. and it certainly extends the process. But in the end, the IE's results were exactly the same as our results in the selection of Sundance, Maverick, and Traverse. And that was nearly 6,000 megawatts bid into that RFP. So, so in summary, I mean, if it's required, we'll certainly work with an IE. Definitely opposed to an IA, an independent administrator. As discussed earlier, I think there's a lot of different characteristics to these agreements and evaluation process, whether it's evaluating feedback on our terms and conditions of an agreement, whether it's feedback on their credit profile, and whether it's feedback too on our engineering standards on how we want the facilities built. So it's really a pretty complicated process. Next slide, please. So to hit on some focus topics, the all source bidding, Andrew talked about it. It was talked about by the developers. In my opinion, and our position basically is that from an IRP perspective, it is selecting the sources, the resources that are appropriate for moving forward with from our operating companies. To go out to the market and just solicit an RFP for an all source without the intent of executing on some of those proposals, it's a little bit misleading and a little bit disingenuous. So definitely not supportive of that. Our IRPs are very detailed. Our corporate planning and budgeting group does a fantastic job developing them, and they've got a lot of folks internal supporting inputs into the IRP. Included in those inputs is information from our group. We're in commercial operations. We run the RFPs, but we also keep our, as the term was used earlier, ear to the ground on what's going on in the market. And as an example, the IRP group will say, hey, how much wind's available in the future? And we already have this data of what's available in PJM or SPP from a wind or solar perspective. It's easy information to pull. It certainly helps those guys build out, what they're going to do in the IRP, or at least some inputs. And likewise, we also have strong relationship with developers. So we've got a pretty good idea of what costs are, what technology improvements are coming along. It's not just costs, it's also production. So we do keep our ear to the ground and keep abreast of what's going on in the market. That second main topic, third-party review. Like I said, an independent evaluator we would certainly work with if required. I don't think it's necessary, but we would work with them and streamline the process best we could. Not interested in an independent administrator. As far as sharing of documents, no problem at all sharing documents with commission staff and independent evaluator. Definitely we would be receptive to that, because that just educates them on the process and really makes things a little bit easier as you go along and you go in for approval of the projects. And then the last bullet point there, required information to be presented in an RFP. I'm going to go through the next few slides here in a second that talks about our RFP process. But in general, the RFP has a lot of details on proposal requirements, minimum construction standards, bid pricing, those types of things. With our RFP, once a bidder has expressed interest and they meet some minimum standards, one of them being they have a project that can meet the commercial operation date, then we would provide to them form agreements, form purchase sale agreements, or a form power purchase agreement, so that they know what they're bidding to. And also part of the requirements of the proposal is if they have any exceptions to them, we want to know those right up front. So again, from compressing that timeline, if there's a big disconnect on the design of the facility or a big disconnect on the terms and conditions of a proposal, we want to know that up front. And also from a design perspective, we will give them our AEP standards. The question that popped up from Laura, has I&M experienced cases where the IE did not agree? Laura, my experience to date, where we've used an IE, I think 2 or 3 times like they're in Oklahoma? No. They've always agreed with our selection. They may have had some pushback on some types of analysis or something calculated, but the actual results they have not that I know of, or the projects and proposals I've been involved with, they have not pushed back. And again, the perfect example was that North Central Wind Facility. That was a big RFP, a lot of inputs, and what made that one challenging was the congestion, a lot of congestion issues in various parts of Oklahoma. You get into the western part of Oklahoma, into the Panhandle, you got killer wind resources, high capacity factors, but the LMP where you're dumping into is very, very low. So that RFP was very complex from evaluating a congestion, but the independent evaluator came back and agreed with our results. Next slide, please. So I'm going to get into the RFP process a little bit here. I mean, issuing the RFP, that's Andrew and his team's ultimate decision. Myself, Jay Godfrey, the VP of Marketing and Renewables, and Zach Yetzer, who also is in the group. We've got plenty of RFPs we're working on. So we wait for a call from Andrew and company that says, hey, this is what we want to do. We work with those guys. We tee up a draft RFP to these guys. We have a lot of questions on inputs. Then we get an RFP drafted. Like I talked about previously, talked about what form documents are available, etc. The table below shows the general requirements to be included in the proposal. And the items highlighted in red, bold, I just want to touch on real quick where these have been, I'll call them improvements to our process to help compress that timeline. The check sheet, I mean, we have a section in the RFPs where it says your proposal needs to include all this. And then at the end of the RFP, there's a data sheet or a check sheet that they have to include in their proposal where they physically, electronically check off each item to make sure that we're not missing anything. Many years ago, people would submit proposals with not all the information, and guess what? We got to track that down. So that's an improvement that's helped. Items 6 and 7, also to help compress that timeline, we ask for exceptions to the form agreements, whether it's a purchase sale agreement. We want to know up front what their issues are with respect to these agreements. We do not expect a red line. We know that takes time, that takes money, outside counsel, etc. We would get to that once we got closer to a short list. But if we know up front there's a big disconnect, that definitely saves us some time. Item 7, exceptions to AEP facility standards. That too helps right up front, lets the developer know, hey, we will only accept X, Y, and Z wind turbines, or we will only accept one of these 10 solar modules or inverters. So they know up front, and these are non-negotiable, what we will accept regarding this equipment. Now, on occasion, we may expand that. We may take a look at what they're offering, but in general, this helps to make sure that they're bidding to similar specs, so we can move the process along. Item 8.2, when we calculate the levelized cost of energy, basically the cost of the project, the dollar per megawatt hour, over the life of the asset, two big components, obviously the price, and then the second component is what's your production, what's your expected production. Well, we trust our developers, we trust our bidders, but when it comes to production, we want it validated. Okay, so with like wind proposals, we'll require an independent third party that the developers submit with their proposal. An independent third party's report on what that expected production is. So that helps to give us confidence of the data that we're giving to the IRP group to do their analysis. Once we shortlist, or prior to shortlisting, we too will hire our own independent consultant, independent engineer to do those same expected annual energy calculations, because that is such a key component to the levelized cost of energy. Next slide, please. So once we get the proposals, we'll look at the proposals with respect to the minimum eligibility and threshold requirements. And these requirements, I've noted a few here, but if there's typically 10 to 12 minimum requirements, and we do articulate each one of those in the RFP. So we're up front saying, hey, if you don't meet this minimum threshold, your proposal will not be moving forward to the evaluation criteria. And if a proposal comes in where they do not meet an eligibility and threshold requirement, we'll get back with the developer and say, hey, you don't have this interconnection agreement, or you don't have your system impact study, which is part of the interconnection study process. And if they can resolve it, or they forgot to submit it, we'll try to work with them. But by eliminating proposals in this step, it gets us down to a group of proposals that are the proposals that are deep in the development stage, that are consistent with our facility design standards, etc. And so we'll move those proposals into the evaluation criteria. And there's two buckets, not surprising: price and non-price. With price, we do the levelized cost of energy, and I talked about a few of those inputs. And then we also do a levelized net cost of energy. And basically what we do is compare the levelized cost of energy, which is specific to the project cost, project production. We compare that cost to what would it cost us if we were to go to market, if we were to go to PJM or SPB. And what we're looking for is a net benefit of the project by acquiring or purchasing the power from a project. So we looked at levelized net cost of energy. And then Andrew and his team will look at rate impacts. From a non-price perspective, we'll look at the development status, environmental impact, and these are examples, and what we'll look at from a non-price perspective. What we found over the years is, since we are very detailed on the minimum eligibility threshold requirements, then in the non-price category, a lot of the proposals are pretty tight to each other in final score, if you will, in the non-price category. In general, and I mean 90+% of the time, it comes down to price. But we do look at the non-price. It's important, but I think it ends up being price because we have a pretty good filter on the front end, and we'll use the price and non-price ranking to direct our decision. The net cost of energy. Julie, we start with the levelized cost of energy, and what the levelized cost of energy looks at is the cost of the project and the production. So the production is your capacity factor. The levelized net cost of energy, we will include the capacity value, whether it's PJM or SPP. That component is taken into consideration in the levelized net cost of energy. Yes. And I think that's the last. I think that's the last slide.
So now, Joe, if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Meredith, are there any questions in the chat?
I think he already answered Laura and Julie's questions, and I don't see any other ones coming in.
Okay. Should we open it up to the phone lines? I can't see the raise a hand with my screen being shared like this. And I also do understand that opening my email was working well because it was opening on my other screen. But of course, that last email opened up on the screen being shared. So I apologize for that. Any questions on the phone? Remember to star 6 to unmute. Okay, well, hearing none, we will go ahead and turn it over to Keith Troyer at Consumers Energy.
Hi, Jesse. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, you sound good, Keith. You can
Okay.
go ahead and take it away then.
Yeah, just in terms of logistics, looks like we're running behind about 15 minutes or so. I can try to get us caught up, but I do acknowledge that I've got, 14 or 15 slides to get through in 30 minutes. So I'll do my best.
Thanks, Keith. I appreciate it.
Yep, no problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Troyer. I'm the Director of Electric Grid Integration Contracts and Settlements for Consumers Energy. My team's responsibilities include power purchase agreement administration, competitive solicitations, interconnection agreements, settlements with our PPA suppliers, and settlements with MISO. So with that, we can go to the next slide. For those that have participated with us in past work groups, this is a pretty typical disclaimer that we provide. The intent of our presentation today is for education and discussion. We will be filing comments via the commenting process that has been identified for this work group. So the company's official position will be documented in those comments that we provide at the end of the month. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. The purpose of the presentation today is to cover two topics. First, we're going to talk a little bit about Consumers Energy's experiences and different solicitations that we've issued. And then we'll talk more about the perspective on the work group topics that we're discussing today. Next slide. Thank you. The company's implemented numerous RFPs since the 2008 energy law was issued. Those solicitations were for the company's renewable energy plan and were based on the guidelines adopted by the Commission with the December 4th, 2008 order. These solicitations that we issued were looking for a variety of renewable technologies that you can see on the slide here. And in more recent solicitations, we had also asked for hybrid technologies such as wind plus storage and solar plus storage. With these solicitations, they were set up for a variety of different purchase structures, including power purchase agreements, build transfer agreements, and development asset acquisitions. The way that the evaluations were performed used an approach that addressed both the quantitative attributes of the project, including the cost and the value, and then also a qualitative evaluation that was looking at things like project risk, developer experience, and so forth. Those solicitations, just the last note, those were issued internally and administered by the company. We did not use a third party in the renewable energy plan RFPs. The company also has experience contracting through reverse auctions. So we've successfully run several reverse auctions. Those were for capacity purchases. So in the context of all source, the company didn't seek any particular technology in these solicitations. We were just looking for the commodity of zonal resource credits. That's the capacity commodity that we can use to meet our MISO planning reserve margin requirements. We did use what we would call an independent administrator to run the solicitation. But just a point of note for this work group is the way that we use an independent administrator internally appears to be more similar to how the work group's discussing the role of an independent evaluator. So with this solicitation and the IRP solicitations I'll talk about next, the reason that we use independent administrator as our definition is because they're the ones that issue the solicitations. They work with the respondents. They communicate qualification requirements, implement screening requirements, and then do the evaluation and provide us with a blind ranking. But the process by which we set up the solicitations, including how, what resources we're looking for, how much we're looking for, and then also the selection on the back end of the solicitation, those are functions that Consumers Energy has performed. So even when you see the term independent administrator on these slides, just keep in mind that we are part of the process on the front end to set up the solicitation, and we're also part of the process on the back end to do the selection. the independent administrator role was set up in accordance with the FERC guidance for affiliate transactions. So with these reverse auctions, we allowed our affiliate to participate, and there's a certain criteria that the FERC has to enable that to occur, so that they could participate in the solicitation. And these solicitations were predominantly looking at qualitative attributes, so the volume of ZRCs and the pricing of ZRCs. Once a bidder was qualified, there wasn't additional qualitative evaluation or consideration of that respondent. Laura, to answer your question, yes, that is correct. So when we use an independent administrator for our solicitations, they provide to us a blind ranking. We do our selection based off of the blind ranking, and once they've confirmed our selection, they will then release to us the counterparties that provided those bids. And it's that point in time where we would enter the transactions. One other important note on the reverse auctions is that to enable these to occur, the approach that we took with our independent administrator was to pre-negotiate all of the agreements and transaction confirmations that would be executed after the event. So it does include a fair amount of front-end work with respondents who ultimately aren't selected. But for those that are familiar with the master EEI agreement that was used, that's a pretty standard form document. The transactions are fairly simple, a couple pages, but having those pre-negotiated and ready to sign when the bid event occurred enables us to enter into those transactions very quickly once the reverse auction takes place. Next slide, please. Our integrated resource plan includes a post-IRP solicitation process by which we procure new solar assets as part of our solar glide path. The IRP procurement process is based off of the 2008 guidelines for competitive RFPs, much like we did for the renewable energy plan. But there are a couple of modifications or additions to those guidelines that are documented in our settlement agreement. The first is that the company has agreed to use an independent administrator for the purpose of issuing the solicitation and providing us with that blind ranking. The other piece is that we agreed to provide the terms of the contract in accordance with the reference to MCL 66. This is a practice that we've been implementing for the last 3 or 4 years with our renewable energy plan solicitations. By providing the template contract, there's some benefit to narrowing the window of negotiable items, which will help us to ensure a better apples to apples comparison of the proposals. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. With the Integrated Resource Plan, RFP, the company also bids its company developed projects into that solicitation. There are 2 parts to the solicitation. The company will be procuring at least 50% from power purchase agreements and may procure up to 50% through build transfer agreements or company proposals. So the role of our independent administrator in this process is to ensure that we can't determine which of the projects in the company-owned side are developed internally and which ones are submitted by third parties through the use of a build transfer agreement. The the evaluation is done using a couple of mechanisms. We do have a screening process that respondents go through, as well as with qualifying their projects. The way that the evaluation is completed is that we look at the cost, we look at the commodity value that's being provided by the resource, and then we have, rather than using a qualitative matrix, we use value-added criteria. And the value-added criteria are meant to represent additional environmental or societal benefits that the project provides. I do note that there's, on this slide, we say qualitative ranking, but it's really a quantitative ranking, but it uses the value-added criteria, which aren't necessarily able to be determined based on a cost. So it's kind of a combination of qualitative and quantitative impacts that result in a blind ranking list that's provided to the company. And I apologize if I just made that more confusing. To answer Rob's question, yes, we do have the interconnection status as one of the screening requirements, and that the projects are going through the development stage and have some certainty over their interconnection costs. I don't recall the specific point at which they have to be in the interconnection process, but we do have a criteria for both distribution connected projects and transmission connected projects. The other item that I haven't touched on yet is while the solicitation is looking for solar, we do also provide PURPA qualifying facilities the opportunity to participate. So they can submit a bid, a competitive bid that would be offered, that would be competing with the solar assets, that would be open to any PURPA QF technology. Okay. Next slide, please. So to summarize the company's perspective over the topics of the solicitation, we put together the next set of slides. First off, the company prefers the use of guidelines versus rule sets for competitive procurements. There's a couple reasons for that. One thing that we've been striving for is continuous improvement of our solicitation process. So in each of our subsequent solicitations, we take the lessons that we learned in the past solicitations, make modifications to the process or modifications to the documents that are provided in order to ensure that we're continuing to make that a better procurement process for both us and the respondents to ensure that we can get the best proposals received. Next is that the reason we would prefer guidelines over rule sets is that different utilities and their customers are structured in different ways and have different processes by which they procure. And we think that guidelines would provide the opportunity for flexibility on a utility to utility basis, given that we are different sizes and that we're procuring different resources. So we think guidelines would better enable that flexibility to continue. We have over a decade of experience using the 2008 guidelines for the renewable energy supply procurement. And these guidelines have worked well for us to serve our renewable energy plan. They are also the basis, as I had mentioned, for our IRP solicitation process, which is the post-IRP procurement process. Next slide, please. Jesse, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. One thing that is a little bit challenging for us in kind of stating what our position is on different aspects is that part of the discussion in this work group is that we're talking about the MPSC order and the things that the commission would like us to look at as part of the work group process. We're also talking about the FERC order and how that applies for setting PURPA avoided costs. And then we're also bringing in conversation about the Michigan Statute 66 for the pre-IRP requirements. And we have different legal positions based on those different orders or statutes. And so it's a little bit challenging to kind of bring all of those items together, which is part of the reason for the disclaimer at the beginning of my presentation is that our position largely depends on which topic in particular we're talking about and how it meets these requirements. So with regard to the next set of slides, I guess I would ask you to keep in mind that we're generally talking about our post-IRP procurement activities. However, we might take different positions if these guidelines, were anticipated to result in requirements for commodity purchases or voluntary green pricing programs or our utility administered distribution-based programs like demand response. So we'll be talking about these in the context of post-IRP solicitation processes. Go ahead and go to the next slide. For all source bidding, as I had mentioned before, we do have some experience in what could be interpreted as all source bidding using our reverse auctions where we're just looking at commodities. But if we're referring to all source bidding as pursuing all technology resources or opening up the solicitation to pursue all technology resources, we do have some concern with using that as the basis. One is that the company believes that our IRP is kind of the guideline that would select the appropriate resource to fill future needs. And so if we have an IRP that specifies a certain technology for our solicitations post-IRP, and then we open it up to all source bidding, we believe that that really undermines the IRP and the purpose of that process. We do believe that all source bidding could be a useful tool if its purpose is to collect pricing information that's not publicly available. That would include new or unique technology that doesn't have a history of publicly available data sources. We would note on the pre-IRP solicitations is that there are requirements in the statute about when and when not those pre-IRP solicitations are required. And so having a pre-IRP all source process when it's not required for the IRP could needlessly complicate the IRP process. Next slide, please. We do also note that there are some challenges on an administration side for incorporating all source bids into the post-IRP solicitation process. In order to enable all source bidding, we would need to anticipate with the evaluation tools all of the potential resources that could be submitted. This would become a larger issue if we are using an independent administrator to serve in this role, because to the extent that they need the utility to provide them with the evaluation tools, we would need to come up with an entire suite across all technology options, including the potential for hybrid options that include multiple technologies. We do also see kind of along the lines of our concerns regarding the IRP picking the technology. We do see concern as well from our perspective on how all source bidding fits into our corporate strategy. Consumers Energy has a triple bottom line strategy that focuses on people, planet, and prosperity. And if our IRP is being driven by our company's strategy, it wouldn't be necessary for us to procure technology resources that don't fit in line with, for example, with our planet goals. And so we would see all source bidding as potentially in conflict with our corporate strategy. Last item is, with our experience, all source bidding for commodities, that we think that is fairly straightforward when you're just looking for blocks of capacity or blocks of energy, and we're really technology agnostic. That could be a good utilization for all source bidding. Okay, next slide, please. The next topic on third-party review. I would note that, as we're thinking about what to discuss regarding this topic, it is a fairly complex topic and largely depends on what is meant by a third party. Overall, we believe that the MPSC staff and the commission provide enough oversight of the confidential materials, including the bids. An independent administrator can provide sufficient third-party review of the entire process, the evaluation, and the confidential bid information. We do have I apologize. We do have a lot of concern over additional third-party review of confidential information such as bid pricing because of the potential threat of release of information, whether it's intentional or unintentional or indirect, that if respondents know that their information might be provided to their competitors, they would be less likely to participate in our solicitations. And so to the extent that we have market confidential information, we would like to protect that from third-party review. Next slide, please. The company does have a requirement to use an independent administrator to issue our IRP RFPs as part of our settlement agreement. But we would oppose if third-party review is third-party review of our independent administrator, who's also a third party. We would oppose having that duplicative oversight when the MPSC staff and the commission have the ability to provide the oversight of our independent administrators' actions. With third-party review, the other perspective to look at is we do see a benefit for continuous improvement of our solicitation. If third-party review really means that we're collecting feedback from respondents and other stakeholders about what worked well and what didn't work well in our solicitations so that we can continue to make those solicitations better going forward. So we do enjoy getting that feedback and trying to incorporate it into future solicitations. Next slide, please. On the topic of information that's provided via the RFP, we have provided the evaluation tool that's used for our IRP RFPs. And part of that is because the company is bidding its own projects into the process. So in the interest of ensuring that all of potential respondents have the same information, we issue that evaluation tool before the RFP is issued or at the time that the RFP is issued. There are some pros and cons to doing that. One benefit that you could see is that if respondents understand how their projects are being evaluated, it provides them the opportunity to create the best proposals possible. However, if there is an unintentional flaw in the score sheet and it's discovered by the respondents, we could have a potential issue of gaming where respondents could kind of exploit the flaw in that tool, and it would skew the ranking that comes out of the solicitation. In terms of the value of company assets versus PPAs, Steve touched on it earlier today in the ownership structures. I guess I would just note that the company does believe that there is terminal value in our assets regarding the optionality that's provided to our customers about continued investments to extend the life of those assets. In terms of the qualitative matrix or the value-added criteria that would be provided, that has a similar effect as providing the score sheet if the score sheet is commodity based, where if we have an unintentional flaw in that process, that there could be exploitation of that information, but the benefit would be that by having the qualitative matrix or value-added criteria, the respondents could submit the best proposals possible. We have used template contracts. We think that they're helpful to reduce negotiation time post-solicitation. And one downside of providing the information publicly, kind of back to the earlier conversation this morning, is that it might limit the purchaser's ability, the utility's ability to consider unique proposal structures. So by providing this information publicly, it creates a more rigid RFP process. And the more rigid the process is, the less ability we have to consider some of those unique proposal structures. I saw a question come in from Rob. If the FCM creates a level playing field, I would say based on our IRP testimony, we don't believe it's apples to apples, utility ownership versus PPA. But in the context of our post IRP solicitations, we do have the 50-50 ownership structure, and so that provides some certainty to the utility. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to close out the discussion today, three takeaways from the utility perspective presentation. The first is that we favor the flexibility to tailor our competitive procurements to meet the needs of our customers and the respective utility. For that reason, we do favor guidelines over rule sets as an outcome of this work group. And then lastly, we have a lot of experience with the 2008 guidelines. They are the basis for our IRP solicitations, and we would like the work group to focus on using them as a starting point as we build out future guidelines going forward. And that ends my presentation today. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Keith. That was helpful. Meredith, do we have any additional questions? I think Keith did a pretty good job of answering them as we went through, but anything else that's popped up now that we're on the last slide?
Nope, I think he got them.
All right, we'll open up to the phone lines now. Remember, *6 to unmute. Anyone on the phone? Okay, last call for questions before we turn it over to Dave Harwood at DTE Electric. Thank you so much, Keith. We really appreciate it. By the way, that beard is getting very epic. So
yeah, it is.
Keep it up.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Thanks a lot, Keith. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dave, are you on? Are you able to?
I am. Can you hear me? And
I can hear you. Oh, great background too.
I was going to put a Michigan Stadium back, the big house for you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I chose this one instead.
We would appreciate that. Yeah. All right, Dave, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Jesse. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about our experience in this space, provide our insight in response to the 3 questions you've put in front of us. Also, really appreciate the thoughts and comments from the development community earlier, as well as I&M and consumers. My comments today are, as you'll see, are based heavily on 2 factors before we get started. One would be, our internal desire to continuously improve each time we perform an RFP, which we think we've done over the years, but also at the same time, recognizing what works in support of customer value so that we're not throwing things out or changing things that don't need to be changed. So before I dive into our thoughts on the three questions, I've got a few slides that provide some context, I guess, for everybody on which we base our thoughts. So you can go to the next slide, Jesse. So I've listed our RFPs, at least in the renewable space here, going back to 2009. As many of you are aware, we've been conducting competitive renewable solicitations since shortly after the first statute was passed. And since that time, as mentioned by Keith, as well as I&M, we've looked to both the statutory language in PA 295 and 342, as well as regulatory orders 15800 to guide us in our approach on these competitive solicitations. In addition to that guidance, and at the risk of repeating what others have said, we've worked really closely with the MPSC staff every time we do one of these. The MPSC staff reviews RFP documents and evaluation criteria, our scorecards, all of our documents and all of our process before we issue RFPs. The staff also then reviews the bid responses after they've come in and audits the bid evaluation and selection results after that's complete. So there's multiple touch points with the staff to help us get to the right answer. We've also been diligent, like I said, in improving the process each time based on results and feedback, both from the commission and staff, really with the goal of finding, like we've all stated, right, the best value for customers at the end of the day. And now through these competitive solicitations on this page, we've successfully built or contracted for 21 projects, almost 2,200 megawatts of new renewable capacity. And in total, both PPAs and the utility owned almost $3.5 billion worth of renewable investment in the last decade. So we feel pretty proud of that, and we think we've done a good job so far. So you can go to the next page. Here's another look. Not only have we enabled the 2,200 megawatts of new renewable investment through our RFPs, but also through that process followed the cost reductions in the industry that have been passed on to customers. So with that, let me just make a few comments on our 2019 RFP, our most recent one, which built on all of the RFPs before it and incorporated a lot of learnings and things from previous RFPs. The 2019 RFP in the fall was the largest, broadest one that we had ever done, allowing for both utility-owned and PPA bids, both wind and solar, and multiple year CODs. We were looking for CODs between 2021 and 2023. And so we did, for the first time, also use an independent advisor, which helped us ensure alignment with utility best practices, as well as provided some objective oversight to the quality and the integrity of the results. The market response we got was incredibly robust, in our opinion. We had over 180 unique project options presented to us, representing 7 wind projects and about 50 solar projects. The end result was also pretty good in our mind. We executed on almost 800 megawatts of new renewable capacity out of that single RFP across 8 contracts. Those projects will result in a 40% increase in our renewable portfolio in just 2 years, 2021 and 2022. And although there were 8 contracts representing 6 projects, 6 projects comprising 3 PPAs, 2 build transfers, and 1 self-developed project. So I think with that background, I can jump into how we're thinking about the three topics that Jesse, you put in front of us. So yeah, thanks for advancing. You know, the first one really is about what information should be presented in an RFP. The specific wording that Jesse put in front of us, I've put in the blue ribbon at the top of the slide. Information that we included in our 2019 RFP included the purpose and scope of the RFP. You know, again, wind and solar. We did not make exclusions for additional creative options, as some of the developers previously had mentioned. For example, inclusion of storage options, although we weren't specifically looking for that, we did evaluate options that came to us that it did include storage. Various ownership structures, multiple COD years, like I've mentioned before. We provided a description of the evaluation process and a description of what economic and non-economic evaluation criteria we were going to use. The economic criteria include in the RFP included descriptions acknowledging that we were going to perform some sort of apples to apples, excuse me, comparison for PPAs and build transfers like terminal value and the FCM that we talked about already, in a way to try to adequately compare PPAs to build transfers in the extent that what will customers eventually pay for these projects. Non-economic criteria descriptions were included that, similar to what Keith talked about, really we're trying to get at you know, what's the feasibility of this project? You know, a low-cost bid project that can't be built doesn't do any of us any good. So we really wanted to get at, okay, what are the technical and operation and maintenance factors, experience of the developer in project management, their financial strength and credit worthiness, all those non-pricing factors. And so we described all of those. We did include in the RFP pro forma contracts, template contracts, if you will, for both build transfer and PPA. And on the build transfer side, also included technical specifications that we were looking for the developer to build projects to, construction and engineering specifications. And as I mentioned before, you know, all of this information seemed to result in a good, robust response. And the contract, the 6 projects, I should say, that came out of this RFP, both allowed us to complete our RPS, our 15% RPS compliance plan, as well as get a really good jump start on our voluntary green pricing supply. So jumping forward, you can jump one more slide. So I would say our experience, through our experience, we believe there is an appropriate amount of information necessary in an RFP to enable bidders to make reasonable, creative, and honest proposals. Clearly, too little information can result in vague and misleading bids that don't serve anybody's best interest. And it can also contribute to a less than robust market response, since I think developers can often equate, you know, lack of detail in an RFP to lack of seriousness on the buyer's part. But just as much, I think too much information, especially with regard to score sheets and specific scoring criteria, can also result in reverse engineered bids that look good on paper, but can misrepresent the true feasibility and cost of a project. So, you know, we believe there's a right amount of information that enables quality responses, creative responses. To that end, we've listed a few thoughts, in the spirit of continuous improvement, on things that going forward we would add or consider adding to our RFPs that we haven't in the past. A little bit more detail, perhaps, on the weighting of economic and non-economic factors without getting too detailed. maybe a better description than we've done in the past on how we're going to evaluate terminal value and maybe FCM if that's appropriate. And so we're open to having a conversation about that. Let's jump to the next slide, which is the second item. Again, I've put the exact wording in the blue ribbon at the top, but this topic was really about, you know, what RFP documents are appropriate to share with who. You know, I've already mentioned that all the documents in our full process was shared with MPSC staff prior to issuance in our RFPs, and MPSC involvement in our process, you know, has led to several improvements over the years, and specifically even with the 2019 RFP, with respect to broadening the scope and broadening our scorecard mechanics to include the pricing detailed pre and post adjustments for terminal value and FCM, and so that we could clearly discuss with them, you know, what did a as bid proposal look like, and what did it look like with these adjustments afterwards. So while understanding that there, you know, are not too many, you know, we don't have a lot of regulatory guidance regarding regarding the use of a third-party advisor, you know, we did engage Navigant in our last RFP to advise and oversee the RFP process. And similar to staff, all of our documents and all of our scoring mechanisms and results were shared and observed and verified by Navigant. And we found that experience to be beneficial to our process, as it aligned us with best practices in the industry. They provided some objective oversight, ensuring that the quality and integrity of the results. And especially since, you know, as some have mentioned, you know, we were evaluating a self-developed project in this process. And so we needed somebody to watch us do that and make sure that we were doing that fairly. Okay, I think that's probably it for that one. We can go to the next one. So as we've done in the past, you know, we certainly expect to make improvements in our future solicitation processes based on the lessons we've learned. And in this case, you know, whatever changes or recommendations are made out of this collaborative effort. As I've stated before, you know, the MPSC staff review and audit of our RFP documents throughout the process has worked well. And our use of the advisor, Navigant, independent advisor in our last RFP also worked well. Couple of things that we've already identified that may help us improve in the future is maybe an earlier engagement of that advisor, so that they can do even a better job of helping us align with best practices and designing the RFP in advance. And perhaps, you know, like we do in the IRP space, some pre and post stakeholder meetings, and maybe the potential for pre-qualification of bids, like we've talked about. However, I would, you know, we would recommend we stop there with respect to sharing bid documents. Like many have said, you know, sharing bid documents with other third parties, we think is inconsistent with the confidentiality that bidders expect, and it would be counter to running an effective and robust RFP. But with the changes that I've suggested that we're already considering, you know, we think that we can create a process that is consistent with the pillars of the Allegheny standard, which I know many of us are looking at. So with that, I'll jump to the next slide. So this is the third item. Again, I've got the topic in the blue ribbon at the top. How do we accomplish all source bidding? When does it make sense? And our position here is similar to what I think you've heard in this meeting previously. You know, our RFPs have resulted from the needs identified to comply with the RPS or to serve our VGP load. Scope of the RFPs were determined by this need, and we used the guidance that we had from the MPSC and the statutes, like I already said. And if we have a situation where an RPS need or a VGP need or an IRP need actually requires all resource types, then maybe that makes sense. But most often, if not always, there's a specific resource that we're looking for to meet a specific need, and RFPs that we do should be limited to that resource. And that's actually, in our opinion, supported by the current statute in 6T6. Our experience has shown that, obviously robust market response comes when numerous quality of bids come our way. When the market knows that we have an intent to execute, but not when we're just simply looking for information, whether it's in the form of an RFI before an IRP. Or doing an all source when we're really not looking for all sources. The developer community knows that, and will respond accordingly. So I think that's probably it there. And then we can, just, in the spirit of time, maybe I don't read all of these to you, this conclusion, but I think in general, we feel like the decade of experience we have now in this competitive solicitation process has created a lot of learnings for us. Where costs continue to go down, and we're taking advantage of that each time we do one. We continue to apply learnings each time. The last RFP we think was very successful with the amount of megawatts that we're going to be adding over the next couple of years. And we think that our consultation with MPSC staff throughout these processes has been very beneficial. We want to continue that. The use of an independent advisor was also beneficial in our last RFP, and we think there's probably some tweaks we can do there to make it even better. And we're just looking forward to working with everybody to make this process work for our customers at the end of the day. So I guess with that, I can entertain any questions.
Meredith, any questions in the chat?
I don't see any. I think they're going easy on Dave here.
I know. Maybe Dave, maybe you just did such a good job that you answered all the questions in advance. Any questions on the phone? Okay, well, thank you so much, Dave. We appreciate that presentation, and we appreciate all the all the utility presentations as well. Andrew, Joe, Keith, Dave, thank you guys for giving your background and feedback to the questions that were posed. Like I said, those were the same questions that were also posed to the developer panel, so that it was helpful to understand the perspectives there. And it's interesting to hear that on many of those topics that the developers and the utilities agree and align with respect to all source bidding and the third-party review of contracts and the required information to be included. So I know that this has been pretty renewable heavy, and I get that, and I know that as we move forward with this process should also apply to non-renewable resources as well, or that's the idea, and trying to figure out how that works. But the reason for the renewable heaviness in this is that is where most of Michigan's experience has been for the last, 10 years anyway. And so I just don't want to lose track of the fact that as we go forward and develop this guideline document with the background information that we now have after this meeting and our previous meeting, that that this is also could potentially and should potentially apply to not just renewables, but other resources. And I know that Keith had mentioned in his presentation that there might be different answers for different types of resource acquisitions, whether that be through an IRP process or for demand response or for voluntary green pricing programs. And so as you guys are thinking about your comments on the straw proposal guidance document, be thinking in terms of those other types of resource acquisition activities as well. So as you can see here, this is the final slide, kind of our outro here, but the timeline in the next steps. As I mentioned in our first competitive procurement meeting, that we were going to release the staff strawman proposal. That was released. I've provided the long link here so that you guys can kind of see what that link looks like. If you haven't already looked at it, hopefully you guys are well on your way to developing the comments on that, which will be due on October 30th. In addition to the comments on the strawman proposal, the straw proposal, we are also looking for comments on the pre versus post IRP, the issues related to that, and any additional comments that folks feel need to be expressed. Please send those comments to me by the end of the day on October 30th. And then we'll have a follow-up meeting to kind of go through those comments and go through the staff straw proposal at a November meeting. I'm also going to be reaching out to folks that did comment and have substantial comments on the straw proposal and on the pre versus post IRP issues, to ask if they would like to present at a November meeting. So be ready for those invites. And with that, is there any parting questions, comments, suggestions before we end for the day?
Jesse, I think Margareta has her hand up.
All right, Margareta, go ahead.
Hey, Jesse, I raised my hand for you.
Thank
you for organizing this. This was a really useful presentation. And I just kind of wanted to respond to one of the things that you mentioned here right at the end, about talking about a lot of renewables and sort of, it isn't just renewables that we're talking about, but there are a lot of other technologies. I did want to kind of get a sense from you, especially as we're all drafting these comments. I mean, my assumption as I'm working through this process is that we should be thinking about the future and what we think the future of Michigan's energy resources are going to look like and how this plays into that process. And it might be that there are like tweaks and differences if you're thinking about emerging technologies versus like competitive bidding for coal plants, which I assume none of us is really anticipating is what is going to happen going forward. Right. I assume that you don't want us to be so like blind to the realities of the world that we aren't considering what the future is likely to look like.
Right. No, I mean, we do have a good idea at this point of what the Michigan energy future is going to look like because of the IRPs that have already been filed. So with respect to the resources that we see coming out of that, that's what I'm hoping that we can kind of craft the guidance document around, but also taking into account other programs that are included in the IRP but might not necessarily be called out as much, but such as the VGP and the demand response and things of that nature.
Okay, cool. That is helpful explanation. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay.
And Jesse, will the comments be posted to the web for others to review?
I think that was our intent. Yes, that we will either post the comments directly or go ahead and summarize those comments. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what I guess it depends on what exactly we see when those comments come in. But yes, the intent is that those comments will be available for everyone. So don't talk bad about Margareta or anyone in your comments. Sorry, I was just picking on you because you just said something, Margareta. So
at this point, I've heard it all before, Jesse.
Yes, that would be the intent. Anything else before we adjourn? Well, again, thank you to all the presenters today. This was really helpful as we continue to craft our comments and responses to the straw proposal and this issue of pre versus post IRP. I just can't thank everyone enough for this. This is all very helpful information as we move forward with this process, and should give us a really good foot forward to getting a really impressive document out of this. So thanks again to everyone, and I think we are right on time to adjourn 45. All right.
Yep.
Well,
thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.